Maybe you're like me and you've watched a ton of videos on Cine EI and you still have not figured it out. So I just wanted to kind of dumb everything down and really be able to explain what Cine EI actually is, what the benefits are, and how you can use it effectively on your next shoot. So getting into what Cine EI actually does. First, the EI is exposure index, and it allows you to do a couple different things. One, it allows you to shoot in S-Log3, which gives you the most dynamic range on your camera and gives you more flexibility in post to be able to keep that information in the highlights and the shadows. So being able to shoot in log is a huge plus. The other benefit that it offers is just limiting your ISO options to 2, which are the dual native ISOs that either the FX3, FX30, or FX3 offer. So I think this is great because it just creates kind of a no hassle option where you're not accidentally flicking your ISO to a different value other than your native ISO that's going to create a noisier image. You always want to make sure you got the cleanest image possible, and having just those 2 options for your dual ISO is perfect. So far, so good, hopefully. Those are just kind of the 2 main things, shooting in log and then just sticking to those 2 ISO values, giving you the cleanest and most dynamic range possible. So now let's get into kind of the third part of what Cine EI is really used for. And I think this is where everybody gets most confused, and this is where kind of more technical stuff is going on, so to speak. And the question is always just like, well, what the heck is the point of any of it? So let me try and break it down as simply as possible, show you an example just with this shot right here, just because I think it does require a lot of dynamic range. There's a lot of dark shadows and highlights. And so I think it'll create a good example for what this could be used for. And hopefully it'll answer that question of what the heck's the point of this thing and what does it all mean? Just like you would do with any other scene, you want to properly expose to the best of your ability, and using just one of the native ISOs, either the 800 or 12,800. This example is at 12,800. Got an ND filter just to bring it down a little bit so that the highlights aren't too harsh. So where Cine EI kind of comes into effect is you've got this scene, for example, and you're kind of thinking in the back of your head, hey, I wonder if the shadows are going to be too noisy in this shot. So with Cine EI, you can change the brightness of the image. So we're going to maybe do that just by turning down the ND on this, brightening up the image. And so we've got 2 stops brighter just by taking 2 stops on the ND. And so now you want to check with the ability of Cine EI, what would this look like if I were to bring it down in post? If I was to adjust my exposure in post. So let me adjust here. So I brought the Cine EI down to a 6400 ISO. So this is not changing what the image looks like on your card. Nothing will be changed on your card. Nothing is baked into the image. Everything just looks different on your flip out screen, and depending on your monitor as well. So it gives you a chance just to preview, just to see what your image would look like in post, to be able to kind of retain those highlights and to be able to not have a noisy image in the shadows. So again, it doesn't bake your ISO, that's 6400, into the card. That's not what your image is going to look like when you look at it in post. Your ISO will be at 12,800, like mine was here. The Cine EI just gives you this extra option to be able to see what would it look like if I did this in post. You always want to make sure that when you're using Cine EI, that your ISO is not going above your native ISO. So if your native ISO is at 12,800 like it is here, your Cine EI does not go above that to get kind of the proper exposure, because anytime that you're going to be boosting up your exposure in post, it's just going to create a super noisy image. If you're bumping up your exposure, those shadows will just turn to crap. So you don't want those noisy shadows. The reason that Cine EI can be helpful is where you're letting in a little bit more light in the camera through ND or aperture, and then bringing that down in post to maintain nice non-noisy shadows, and to be able to just keep those highlights as well and bring those highlights down. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully it makes sense. This is just kind of a preview tool for exposure to see how you could possibly expose your image or what it could look like in post. For me, I don't really use this at all. With my small HD monitor, I use the EL zone to figure out my exposure. That is super helpful. It's like one of the best reasons to buy a small HD monitor. I think that way of exposing and checking your exposure is incredible. I'm making a video on that coming out shortly as well. But I will say I do use the Cine EI just for those first two reasons. To make sure that I can shoot in S-Log3, getting the most dynamic range that I possibly can on my camera. And then that second reason of just not being able to mess with my ISO. I want to make sure that my image, again, is as clean as possible. So sticking with the 800 and 12,800 dual native ISOs, that's what's gonna make my image as clean as possible. And I know maybe you've had it, I've had it before, where you just accidentally bump something and you don't notice, and you've cranked your ISO a little, and your image is then just way more noisy than it needs to be or should have been. So I like those two reasons to use and to shoot on Cine EI. I do not really use that exposure tool, just cranking it down to see what it could look like in post. I'm going to use other ways of exposing. So hopefully that is a quick and relatively easy way to understand what the point of Cine EI is. Let me know in the comments below what you thought. Do you use it? Do I need to explain this a little bit more in the comments below? Let me know. And as always, I'll see you on the next video.